I'm Mary Lucier. I am video artist for many, many years. I started making video in probably 1973 or 4. So I'm sort of a pioneer in the field of video art. 5-channel installation. That's an important question because what we mean by a channel is simply one image or one, as I would have thought of it in the old days, one tape, one videotape. So in this example, there are 5 images playing. That means there are 5 different sources of video playing, in this case, on digital players. And they're synchronized so that everything happens at a prescribed time. Occasionally, all the images are the same, I think like right now, but then they split off and all become different, but everything is synchronized, so it happens, there you go, see? So it happens at the moment when I wanted it to happen. So in order to get it like this, I have to edit it so that everything happens at the time when I want it to happen. And then all you have to do is give it a synchronized start, and it'll play in sync throughout the whole 18 minutes. So that's the definition of 5 channels, is 5 images playing simultaneously from 5 different sources. Multi-channel video has always appealed to me from the very beginning because I came out of sculpture. And to me, this medium, particularly in the old days, so to speak, was comprised of all these boxes, right? These TV monitors that you could arrange in space in any way you wanted to. It could be architectural, it could be sculptural, it could be theatrical, and it could be literary, because there was also a story unfolding inside that box, and you put a couple of them side by side, and you get a spatial connection then among all the different channels. So I was drawn to that very powerfully, very, very early on, and that has been my main genre ever since. Although I do make single-channel film-style pieces, it's rare. Well, I was invited to do this piece. I was commissioned by the North Dakota Museum of Art, where there's a wonderful director who's actually the founding director. Her name is Laurel Reuter, and she lives in Grand Forks, North Dakota, which is where the museum is. And she had called me up one day. There had been a flood in Grand Forks. It was a very severe flood in 1997, I think. And she introduced herself, and I had just been looking at the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, and there was a full page, a picture of Grand Forks, North Dakota, underwater and on fire at the same time, and I was chilled by that image. And she called and said, "Hi, I like your work, I've been following it for years. How would you like a commission to come out to North Dakota to do a piece?" I said, "Absolutely," because I was looking at that image, and it was right in my area of interest, which is the natural environment and what happens to the humans or the human collective within that environment. So that was the first collaboration I did with them. Then she found me another time. I was traveling in Moscow, and she got a hold of me and said, "How would you like to do another project?" And she was working on this project called The Emptying Out of the Plains, and asked a number of artists if they'd do commissioned works. And I said, of course. You know, I liked her, I liked the museum, I liked the people. I had a terrific time working out there, and between the two of us, we raised the money to do this piece, and showed it at first at the North Dakota Museum, which is a beautiful, lovely space.
What year was that?
That would have been 2004. So that was, yeah, a long time after the flood. The flood damage was all gone, but this was all about people who were leaving that area and would never come back. Seems to me that migration is a universal phenomenon, and it's gotten really intense in recent years around the world. This just happens to be a small section of the United States where it's symptomatic. There's no war driving these people out. There really are no natural catastrophes driving them out. It's the lack of a sustainable livelihood. You know, they're way out on the plains here. These towns failed. Many of these are ghost towns. You're seeing a ghost town now. It's very hard for people to make a sustained living. And after the older generation passes, the younger ones don't want to stay. So they leave. And they go to larger cities, or they go to other states, and they do other kinds of work. They don't farm anymore. They don't tend cattle. So Laurel Reuter was very interested in that phenomenon of, which at the time was the largest exodus from the plains that I think had ever occurred in the United States. Because at one time there was a rush into those lands because they were for sale by the government. And by this time, several generations later, the young people were leaving. And since then, of course, there's been this oil boom, natural gas boom, and bust. So the area is once again going through what you might call a traumatic upheaval of prosperity and then loss. I think the idea of migration, that is, of people leaving their homes, leaving their businesses, their occupations, their livelihoods, is universal. And in most cases around the world, it might be famine that's driving people out. But in most cases, in these days, it's war. Look at Syria and the Syrian refugees. So the people from this area, refugees of a different sort, obviously. They were not being bombarded, they weren't being bombed. But they did have to suffer from a failing economy. Well, the architecture of the buildings that we see here are sort of average wood structures, not unusual in any way, I don't think, except for one of the types of building that was common when settlers first settled this area, and those are sod houses, which are made of blocks of mud and grass. And that was the first dwelling when I think the Norwegians may have been the first European settlers in this area, and they built sod houses. Now, that section of this piece has already passed, but they're quite remarkable, kind of dismal, but they were everywhere for a while. And there are still a few left that have not been torn down, and I was able to go inside several of them that we found along the way, and there were some old artifacts left inside, a table, a chair, some kids' toys, things like that. And that's the most remarkable architecture out there, because if you ever read any of the stories about the plains, what winters were like, what they suffered in the wintertime and living in those sod houses, it must have been a nightmare. I'm not kidding, it really must have been. It's surprising they didn't all leave earlier, because life on the plains was really tough and winters were unforgiving. So the architecture was sort of based on the best protection that they could come up with at that time. Wooden houses are more conventional, and that's influenced by architecture that came through from the east of the United States. Yeah, well, my composer's name is Earl Howard. He's a saxophone player and a brilliant electronic composer, electronic musician. He happens to be blind. He's been blind from birth, but we have worked together since 1983 on many, many soundtracks. And well, he's brilliant because we sit together and we have a good time. We have fun too. So I describe to him what's happening. So he gets the idea right away. Then I bring him pre-recorded sound, say of the natural area, you know, what like in the environment, what was going on, the sound of crickets, the sound of on the farm, the sound of the tires going over stones, those kinds of things. And then I describe to him what the scene is. And he doesn't make one long piece that's 18 minutes long. We do it in sections. And then we link those sections together. And sometimes he'll compose an original, a totally original piece, a totally original segment, like 2.5 minutes, let's say, of something. And he'll say to me, okay, Mary, I don't know, I don't think this is gonna work, but try it. And so I'll take it home and plug it on into the picture and watch it and listen to it, and I'll come back and say, Earl, it's perfect. He said, yeah, I knew it was. Or he'll say, I think you're gonna love this. And I come back and I say, no, Earl, it doesn't work at all. He'll say, yeah, I didn't think it would. Well, I find that Earl, the composer, is just so, he's so intelligent to begin with. And his imagination is broad. We're very good friends. We have always communicated well. I don't find him hard to talk to. Some people shy away from blind people. Some artists think if a person can't see their work, that they have a hard time talking to them. I don't have that problem. And so he and I will sit together for weeks at a time, as I described before, and do these various sections, like this will be the farm section, the birth of the calf section, for example. We'll talk about that for a period of time, and I'll give him various sounds, and he will interpret electronically his sounds. Now, he did something else in this piece. Once I said I wanted to use this George Strait song at the end. If you listen carefully to this piece from the beginning, you will hear that melody repeated throughout on the electronic instruments. Only it's very slowed down, it's very sparse, and even I didn't recognize at the very beginning that it was actually the same melody as that song that plays at the end. So he does that, and then in between he will insert other electronic sounds and then natural sounds from the environment. So I don't know, we just compose, he used to say that I was really the composer of my soundtracks. And what he meant by that was that after he would give me all these options, I would make the choices, and I would do the final mix of putting things together. Once in a while, for a couple of pieces, we would go into a professional sound studio for a piece called Noah's Raven that I did at the Toledo Museum of Art. We would put together all these components in some order and then go into professional sound studio and have them make the final mix, which was quite brilliant, actually, I have to say. But in general, I do it. I do the final mix and decide what the balance of sounds is going to be, and when to poke in some, the sound of the calf, or when to poke in the sound of the wheels on the stones, various natural sounds that come from the environment that he's played off of in order to create an electronic soundtrack as well within the piece. I don't really want anything. I'm just offering an experience. And of course I want people to understand and appreciate it and even like it. Sometimes people hate it. Some people hate country music, so they hear that song at the end and they say, how can you live with that? Because they hate, in New York City, sometimes people would react that way. But mostly that's not the case. I had one person criticize me for using so many snow scenes. That was something I couldn't figure out. Why was she upset that so many of the scenes took place in snow? I thought, it snows there. I was there during a number of seasons. I was there in the fall, I was there in the summer, I was there in the winter. And I wanted to represent all the seasons that I had shot in. I wanted to be able to capture them. What I want is to make some sort of impression on people that becomes an experience. For me, this was a journey. It was a journey through landscape. It was a journey through a kind of psychology of inhabitants, people who live here. It was a journey clearly through these events, the rodeo, the farmland, the sod houses. Those things were like events for me. So I want people to be able to participate in that journey, to see it as a kind of, I don't want to say universal exactly, but a more generalized sort of trip that could be metaphorical for them, not literally a trip through the plains, but a trip through maybe a psychological state of some sort. And then to come out of that with reminiscences about where they've been in the piece and what stood out, like what was the relationship of what stood out to the rest of it. What's the rodeo doing there? What's that all about? What's that song all about? What is this, where the images are mixed and overlaid with each other, superimposed? And the sound, the music does the same thing here. It's superimposed with itself. And so everything gets a little out of sync here. And sometimes it's even a little bit out of tune, you might say. It becomes a little more, quote, modernist and less of the popular song and more of a dissonance, perhaps. So that dissonance is an important part of this piece, that people understand the dissonance of life on the plains. And I think the story of the rodeo guys that is in that song is very sad. You know, it's about loneliness. He's lonely out there, and yet he's compelled to chase the next rodeo. It's hard to wonder. It's not hard to wonder. It's hard to know what he gets out of it. But he's obviously addicted. And so I think all of those things are common emotions that people have attached to things other than rodeo, but that can apply on some level to everybody. I have about 3 projects going right now. I just finished a piece that I described to you that was a single channel piece called Untitled Powwow, and which I worked with Earl Howard again, and he did an absolutely brilliant soundtrack, just brilliant. And I'm working on, in 2011 I was in Japan, and I gathered a tremendous amount of material and made some pieces that were specifically for a Japanese audience in the convents, the Buddhist convents of the nuns, the Buddhist nuns. And now I want to revive that work and make a multiple channel piece that's geared more toward a Western audience. And I don't know quite how that's going to happen, but it's a plan. It's been on the back burner for a long time. I'm also doing a project in honor of my late husband, Robert Berlind, who was a painter, and who and I used to exchange ideas about what we looked at when we would go out to work. We looked at similar things. We looked at similar things in the landscape, and we looked at weather, and we looked at ponds. You know, you'd look at like the surface of the water, what's floating on the water, what's underneath, what's on the bottom. And we used to talk about simple things like that, and he'd say to me, why do you have to have a lot of money and a commission in order to make a piece? Why don't you just go out and shoot with your camera? And I said, oh, Bob, that's such a boring idea. Because that's what he would do. He'd go out with his paintbrushes and his dog and paint all day. And he made beautiful paintings. And he also used to argue that they were, in fact, time-based art as well, because you had to stand in front of them for a certain period of time before you got everything that was in them. And so finally I took him up on that. And for years I accumulated footage from around our house in upstate New York. And now I'm ready to put all of that stuff together. He died 2 years ago. And I want to make a kind of an in memoriam piece for him, well, that's a long description of what this is going to be. And that too is going to take quite a while to accomplish. And there's some other things also on the back or near the front burner that I'm working on. And so I have ideas all the time. I mean, I don't ever run short of ideas. I haven't yet had what's, a writer's block or an artist's block. There are times when it takes me a long time to make a piece, like this piece probably took 2 or 3 years to shoot. Because there are these 4 phases of making work. There's pre-production, production, post-production, and exhibition. And you have to raise money for all of those phases in order to make a successful work. And you have to execute all those phases. And it takes time for a big project like this. 5 channels times 18. 18 minutes per channel times 5. So that's way over an hour of actual edited footage. So it's in a way, making a feature film, except it's all split up. So those are my projects.